The right to decide over life and death, the right to inflict death, personally or at random, and the right to abuse power over the other detainees, that was what the Nazi female guards did day after day in the concentration camps during the Second World War. Starting from 1939, hundreds of German women enlisted in the Bund Deutscher Mädel and the Nazi Party to abide by the new precepts established by Adolf Hitler and his Third Reich. They did not miss a warm home, a loving husband, or happy children, as the Führer stated on more than one occasion. These women, despite what they declared before their respective courts, were aware of the barbarism and the consternation they were facing. They decided to become part of a system of torture, sadism, and death, even contravening international laws in times of conflict. Welcome to Frontline War Memoirs. But how is it possible for an ordinary person to become a war criminal? Without a doubt, the answer is that all these people who took part in the war machinery of Nazi horror already had that murderous seed within them. That evil was innate, hidden in some corner of their behavior, but so palpable that it was only necessary to work in an extermination camp among corpses and crying to awaken the most ruthless beasts ever known. If Hitler's men were perverse, they, the guards of the concentration camps, assumed the executing and relentless hand of Aryan justice. There was no judge more atrocious than Maria Mandel, Ilse Koch, Irma Grese, Hermione Braunsteiner, and Dorothea Binz, among others. Each and every one of them established a pattern of training to teach their followers how they should beat, club, flog, mistreat, and abuse their inmates until their death. During this phase of instruction, carried out mainly at the Ravensbrück camp, the future murderers learned to practice sacrifices and to behave like wild animals. Inhumanity was their illustrious pillar. The thousands of inmates of Birkenau, Buchenwald, Majdanek, Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, or Stutthof suffered firsthand the voracious torment inflicted by women who, far from bringing peace and preserving their personal integrity, tore from them completely the little hope they could have in life. Let us begin the journey with the actions of Ilse Koch, a woman with long red hair, of great beauty and strong seductive power, who knew how to captivate her comrades of the protective squads to convince them to make her supervisor of one of the most important Nazi concentration camps of the time. Her sadism knew no bounds, and among her misdeeds was the manufacture of all kinds of lamps with human skin. Hence her terrible nickname, the Fox of Buchenwald. Margaret Ilse Kohler, that was her name before she married, was born on the 22nd of September 1906 into a middle-class family in the German town of Dresden. Daughter of Anna and Emil, a farmer who later became a factory manager, Ilse behaved like any other girl her age. Of calm character, responsible and well-behaved, she became very popular in her school, but beneath that angelic face was hiding one of the most bloodthirsty future Nazi guards of the concentration camps. Immersed in solitude, the young Kohler began to take an unusual interest in the new and dynamic characters who frequently consulted the volumes that filled the shelves of the establishment where she already worked as a teenager in a bookstore in Dresden. That, along with continuous visits, especially from individuals of an official branch of the Nazi Party, meant that this attractive red-headed young woman, with an overwhelming and deceitful personality, soon managed to make her way among their ranks, having affairs with several members of the SS. A decade later, in 1932, Ilse joined the German Nazi Party. She became one of the first women to do so. Getting close to the upper echelons was only a matter of time. Her fascination with uniforms reached such an extreme that she would only meet with members of the Third Reich, officers of the SS, and of the Brownshirts. Later, she would meet Otto Koch, an SS lieutenant with whom she would marry. The nightmare with Ilse Koch began at Villa Koch, as it was formerly known, and extended outward. It was a large house on an estate of approximately 125 hectares on the Ettersberg Hill. At first, although Ilse was the wife of one of the 7 SS officers stationed at Buchenwald, she was not one of those who made friends easily. Soon, Mrs. Koch transformed into a demonic woman. Motherhood had not softened her, far from it. On the contrary, the positive effect that could lie beneath her had become something destructive and biting. In fact, she did not associate with any of the other spouses. Her choleric, sadistic, degenerate character, with great cold-bloodedness and hunger for power, prevented her from doing so. Some later medical reports even described her as a nymphomaniac. For the realization of this phase of depravity and parties, Commander Koch ordered the construction of a sort of riding school where his wife could display her bad arts, both amorous and criminal. The place in question, far from being small, had an extent of 40 by 100 meters and about 20 meters in height. This gigantic dwelling was located a short distance from the concentration camp, so the prisoners in the nearest barracks could perfectly hear what was happening inside. The construction had to be carried out so quickly that about 30 prisoners had fatal accidents and some of them were murdered during the work. Afterwards, she devoted herself to strolling around the camp with a whip in hand, beating those prisoners whose appearance she found unpleasant. As we see, for her beauty was the most important thing. Finally, her cruelty began to unleash itself without any scruples or limits, making the Nazi internment camp her favorite playground. Her perverse pleasure led her to throw dogs at pregnant women, provoking in them absolute terror by making them believe they would be torn apart by those beasts. Once Ilse achieved her purpose, she shrieked with delight. At night, she organized lesbian orgies with the wives of the officers, then proceeded to have sex with her husband's subordinates. The sexual adventures of the commander's wife led her to have relations with up to 12 people at a time. Her depravity was growing. Paul Heller, an inmate and Czech doctor, declared that he personally knew of the abuses of prisoners by Ilse Koch. According to his testimony, one Sunday, the commander's wife appeared with the dogs. She stood in front of them and remained standing for 2 or 3 hours. The prisoners fell silent with fear. Then, several members of the SS began a long series of hard and severe beatings. She observed the scene very calmly. The expression on her face indicated to her followers how much they had to increase the pace of the beatings. There were many officers' wives in the camp and outside it, and no one else did any of that. I believe she did it for pleasure, and for that reason she was solely responsible for her own conscience. They did not pay her for it. She did not wear the SS uniform. She always wore a fur coat and dressed as if she were going to some kind of celebration. She remained there fascinated, and apparently she liked it, Heller asserted. As we see, according to this and other witnesses, Ilse apparently did not have any duty or even an order from any superior to engage in this kind of behavior. Although it is true that her husband, Commander Koch, was always very influential in all areas of her life, there is no witness who explains that his wife was supposed to develop such or any aberrant actions under his supervision. The subject of lamps made with human skin has always been one of the most controversial aspects of the ruthless biography of Ilse Koch. Although numerous objects related to these facts were photographed during the confiscation of all her belongings, no scientific evidence on the subject was found in the forensic report. It should be noted that this medical file was prepared to verify and confirm the alleged human origin of the skins in the capacity of an expert witness at the Dachau trials. Only 3 pieces of one of the most famous excise tattoos were brought to trial, so the facts could never be proven. Despite visual and external indications, the evidence was not conclusive. In this context, it is worth mentioning a surprising fact. During the liberation of the Buchenwald camp, director Billy Wilder made a documentary about the state of the camp and the objects found in it. The image of a table with tattoos, dissected heads, and a supposed lamp went around the world and became a symbol of barbarism. Another of the most ruthless Nazi guards was Irma Grese, who received the nickname of the Angel of Auschwitz. She has been described as the worst woman in the entire camp. There was no cruelty that was not related to her. She regularly participated in the selections for the gas chamber, torturing at will. At Belsen, she continued with the same behavior, equally public. Her specialty was throwing dogs at the poor, defenseless prisoners. Her record as a supervisor took her through the Nazi concentration camps at Auschwitz, Bergen, and Ravensbrück, where she tortured hundreds of her inmates until causing their death. Ironically, she was nicknamed the Angel of Auschwitz, a nickname that particularly filled her with pride. During the celebration of her trial, Grese maintained an attitude that oscillated between indifference and contempt. The dozens of testimonies confirming her perversity and sadism provoked in her an even deeper apathy. Despite her young age, she was only 22 years old. On the 13th of December 1945, she was condemned and executed by hanging by the Allies. Irma Ilse Ida Grese was born in Recken on the 7th of October 1923 into a broken family. Her father, Alfred Grese, a milkman and dissident of the Nazi Party, had been widowed after his wife committed suicide in 1936. 2 years after her mother's death, Irma decided to leave her studies. Nothing motivated her. She was 15 years old, and the only interest she showed was her special fanaticism for the Bund Deutscher Mädel, which her father did not approve. Even so, before starting her career in the Waffen-SS, the young woman was employed for 6 months as a day labourer on a farm, and another 6 as a shop assistant in a store in Lützen. Afterwards, she got a job as a cleaner in a hospital in Hohenlychen, where she remained for 2 years, and when trying to graduate as a nurse, the employment office did not allow her to do so, alleging that she was not suitable for the position. Despite that, the director of the center, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, accused of performing surgical experiments on prisoners from the Ravensbrück and Auschwitz concentration camps, encouraged her not to falter. After all, he had proclaimed himself her tutor during her stay at the hospital, and this impressed 15-year-old had succumbed to the jaws of his reputation and influence. During the 2 years that Grese surrendered to the charm and power of Gebhardt, little is known about the tasks entrusted to her at the sanatorium. In fact, it was the doctor himself who, seeing Grace's eagerness for her work, insisted that she contact one of his friends from Ravensbrück. He did not want her to waste her talent, and perhaps there they would see it as much as he did. In March 1941, Irma arrived at the camp to meet with Gebhardt's colleague. However, she was told to return 6 months later, once she had reached the age of majority. But she did not do so until a year and a half later. During that time, Grese worked at a dairy in Fürstenberg. If there is one trait that characterizes Irma Grese and that she knew how to take full advantage of, it is her physical beauty. Hers was exceptional. A blonde with light eyes and apparent sweetness, her face hid a somber and eerie personality that made everyone who approached her shudder. Many admired her as if she were a movie actress. Nothing should stand between Grese and her future in the SS establishments, not even becoming a mother and starting a family. Olga Lengyel herself, a deported Jew who managed to save herself, said that when Irma became pregnant, she ordered another detainee, a former Hungarian doctor named Gisela Perl, to perform an abortion on her. She feared Grese so much that she helped her, and although she promised to pay her a coat in exchange for her silence, the garment never reached her hands. Perhaps that coldness was the reason that in March 1942, and at the age of 18, Irma Grese finally managed to enter Ravensbrück camp as a volunteer after a previous failed attempt. There she would begin her training. Until then, the Führer's government had not allowed her to get close enough. In fact, her new task as an administrator in the Third Reich's employment office did not delight her family. Rather, on the contrary. Her father was so furious with her that he kicked her out of the house after she appeared wearing the SS uniform during a leave. Joining the Nazi cause deserved more respect than her own family. Ravensbrück, with a capacity for 20,000 female prisoners, had become her new home, and her comrades her true kin. It was there where, in addition to taking care of the centre's administration, she became familiar with the arduous work that was carried out in the facility. In that place, they trained all the female SS personnel, around 3,500 women, who later went on to supervise other camps. From here came out guards as sadistic as Hildegard Neumann, Dorothea Binz, or Maria Mandel. After this period of learning, in March 1943, Irma Grese was transferred to Auschwitz and assigned to the Birkenau concentration camp, where at first she performed tasks of supply control, mail handling, and the Straßenbaukommando, the road construction unit. She had not yet reached 20 years of age, and her career was still on the rise. In the autumn of that same year, Grese was appointed SS Oberaufseherin, chief supervisor. Irma Grese was the second highest-ranking woman in the camp after Maria Mandel, which meant that she was in charge of about 30,000 inmates of Jewish origin, mostly Polish and Hungarian. The new responsibilities of the young Nazi included the direct control of the prisoners, as well as the selection of those condemned to the gas chamber. It is true that during her trial, and displaying an authentically brilliant cynicism, Irma always denied this fact, stating that she only learned of these mass executions from the prisoners themselves. The prisoners had to form groups of 5. It was my duty that they did so. Then Dr. Mengele would come and make the selection. Despite her implicating Mengele, with whom she supposedly maintained a close sentimental relationship, the reality was not as she portrayed it. During the selection process, Irma Grese, Dr. Death, and the guard Margot Drexler decided who would live and who would not. Although the multiple testimonies of the survivors accumulated to describe in all its details the barbarities carried out by the one they came to call the Angel of Auschwitz, the Beautiful Beast, or the Bitch of Belsen, these epithets only served to increase her bad reputation throughout the camp. Her excessive heartlessness led to Irma Grese being accused of murders and tortures. Witnesses claimed that she would walk through the barracks with her uniform immaculate, her blonde hair, heavy and shiny tall boots, a whip, and a pistol. During her rounds, she was accompanied by her dogs, always hungry and furious, which Irma used at her whim. One of her amusements was to throw these beasts against the inmates so that they would be devoured. Another of her modus operandi consisted of murdering the inmates by shooting them coldly. Sexual abuses and the humiliation of children were habitual practices. Irma knew no limits. Her extreme immorality led her to give fierce beatings with a braided whip until causing the death of her victims. In this sense, this sober woman used to look for well-built Jewish women with the intention of destroying their breasts. Afterwards, they were taken to a doctor to be subjected to a painful operation. Irma Grese watched this episode with great excitement. An anonymous inmate declared, "She hit her in the face with her fists, and when the woman fell to the ground, she sat on her. Her face turned blue. Any pretext was enough to trigger punishment and, in most cases, death. The prisoners were treated as mere guinea pigs. Any medical test was valid if it managed to inflict extreme suffering. Everything was lawful, especially if it was for the use and enjoyment of the furious Nazi. She even took the eyes out of a girl when she saw her talking to an acquaintance through the barbed wire," assured a survivor. Currently, it is still not known exactly how many murders the beast could have inflicted in Block C of the Birkenau camp of Auschwitz. It is said that the daily average was 30 crimes, and the capacity of her pavilion was 30,000 inmates. Despite the cruelty of these acts, the administration of Auschwitz never interfered in Grese's activities, and this passivity was common among the SS regarding similar actions. One of their slogans stated, "Tolerance means weakness," and no one could afford the luxury of the prisoners seeing any sign of weakness from them. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not the only concentration camp that suffered the ferocity of Irma Grese. For a brief period, the young woman returned again to the Ravensbrück camp before being sent to Bergen-Belsen, near Hanover, Germany. During her selections, she wielded her whip liberally. She would strike wherever she pleased, and the prisoners had nothing more to do than to endure as best they could. The contortions of pain and the blood that the prisoners shed made her smile. One day in June of 1944, 315 selected women were pushed into the showers. The poor unfortunate ones had already been ground by kicks and whips in the Great Hall. Then Irma Grese ordered the SS guards to nail the door. It was that simple. Before being sent to the gas chamber, they had to be inspected by Dr. Klein. But he made them wait 3 days. During that time, the condemned women had to live crammed and lying on the cement floor without food or drink or excuses. Isabella Leitner and Olga Lengyel reported that Irma Grese had bisexual and, more recently, homosexual relations with prisoners whom she then sent to the crematorium. Helene Klein explained that Grese exercised with the prisoners, forcing them to do push-ups for hours and hours. If one of them stopped, Grese would hit her with a whip that she always carried with her. In Barrack 9 of Camp A, 2 girls were selected for the gas chamber. They jumped out the window and, while lying on the ground, Grese shot them twice. Clara Lebowitz said that Grese forced the prisoners to remain in formation for hours, holding large stones above their heads. Continuing with another of the Nazi guards was Maria Mandel, better known as the Beast of Auschwitz. She played a Machiavellian role within the Holocaust. She knew how to win the respect of her comrades and the fear of her subordinates. To these last ones, the inmates who saw her grow in power and sadism gave her the name of Jewish pets, because they did everything possible to cheer up their boring afternoons in Auschwitz. Her tormented and confused nature made Maria Mandel behave like 2 different people, as if she had a split personality. She could immerse herself in classical music played by the barracks band, or beat a prisoner to exhaustion who dared to bother her with his gaze. Atrocious, repugnant, and depraved were some of the adjectives heard during her trial, and whose court sentenced her to death. Maria Mandel was born on the 10th of January 1912 in the Austrian town of Münzkirchen in the north of the country, a municipality belonging to the district of Scharding in Upper Austria that turned out to be an almost idyllic place. Located in a small valley, surrounded by mountains and verdant landscapes, at the confluence of the Danube between Innu and the Austro-Bavarian border, that is where Maria Mandel grew up. In 1938, after a disastrous working life, Maria Mandel went to visit her uncle, who lived in Munich, where he held an important position as chief of police. Her obsession was the investigation department because she knew firsthand how extensive the work was. Furthermore, she understood that the agents were well paid. With the advice and help of this relative, Maria managed to enter on the 15th of October 1938 as an Aufseherin, guard, in the Lichtenburg internment camp, one of the first savage camps of the Nazi Empire in Pretten, near Torgau, Germany, which in May 1939 became a sub-camp of Ravensbrück. These facilities were used to imprison both Jewish women and women who resisted the Chancellor's regime. As a guard in Lichtenburg, Maria Mandel worked with another 50 women of the Waffen-SS, with whom she shared much more than a possible approach to the German government. In this case, most of the middle-aged women were in a difficult economic situation with low wages, and this job was an escape from their problems. Therefore, Mandel felt virtually obliged to make the radical decision to join one of the first female concentration camps. It was at Ravensbrück where Maria quickly impressed her superiors for 2 reasons. First, for her physique. She was very attractive, of medium height, blonde hair, large blue eyes, rosy complexion, regular features and good build, and also young. She was only 30 years old. And second, for the aptitudes and attitudes she showed in the execution of her duties. Severity and overstepping boundaries were key pieces to achieve a rapid rise to SS Oberaufseherin, chief supervisor, in June 1942. However, that enigmatically beautiful and well-built and so typically Aryan aspect, besides earning her the favor of her superiors, served her to win the sympathy of her inmates. In the camp, Mandel strictly took roll call of the work and tasks that the prisoners had to carry out daily. If any did not meet what was required, she would inflict a severe punishment on them as a consequence. The penalties they received were of such iniquity that Mandel began to treat her inmates like Jewish pets. After beating them and practicing all kinds of flagellations and tortures on them, she condemned them to death. She carried out these executions when she grew tired of her guinea pigs. That misuse of the Jews was so impressive that out of the 55,000 guards who served in the Ravensbrück camp, of which 3,600 were women, no one ever stood out more than Mandel. The inflexibility and savagery of her actions and the unjust murders she perpetrated always surpassed those of her comrades. Simply put, Mandel aroused passions in every sense, while at the same time all kinds of revulsion. Her provocative beauty crept into the thoughts of the inmates, and her own colleagues praised her somber and brusque personality that broke the harmony that reigned throughout the camp. Among the lies that Mandel certified during a hearing in court was the one that pointed to information about the treatments that had taken place in Ravensbrück. The supervisor seemed not to know what they were referring to when they spoke exactly about the mistreatment during her service. The evidence provided alluded to the obvious pseudo-medical experiments carried out on the prisoners during their stay at the camp, which she theoretically was unaware of. According to Mandel, these detainees were used for sewing work, textiles, coat manufacturing, agriculture, cooking, office work, sand extraction, etc. But she never had any knowledge of the experimental procedures that the camp doctors carried out, because she was simply a mere guard. The presence of Mandel in the concentration camp walking through the facility sparked widespread panic among the captives. All were aware of her heartlessness. All knew her obscenities and martyrdoms, to the point that the Aufseherin ended up being one of the most hated and repudiated people in the center. Her way of walking, her uniform, and her so demonized white gloves gave her great hauteur to control her subordinates. This garment, apparently harmless, was a key piece in the mistreatment. When Mandel used it, she struck the victim on the head and above the neck, or between the nose and the eyes, inevitably causing them to fall to the ground. There was no way for them to remain standing. She always ended up with gloves full of blood. We suppose she liked to see the suffering in that way, since generally the supervisors wore black leather gloves. Mandel preferred to change that custom and opt for the fetishism of white. The brutality unleashed against the inmates in the form of slaps and torments, and the use of the most sophisticated punishment and harassment methods, earned her the nickname the Tigress. She became the perfect administrator of punishment. With just one strong blow to the stomach or a punch to the jaw, she could knock anyone to the ground. The effect was such that the survivor fell to the ground immediately, completely stunned and confused, with no chance to defend themselves. However, her end came in Krakow, before a court eager to hear the horrifying details of the Auschwitz and Birkenau concentration camps. Among the accused were high-ranking prisoners, Commanders Rudolf Höss and Arthur Liebehenschel, Maria Mandel, who ran the women's camp, Johann Kramer, senior physician, and others. The highest of the accused, Rudolf Höss, testified in favor of the prosecution in the famous Nuremberg trial. During the trial, which lasted for months, it was possible to hear not only the testimonies of those who participated actively in the mass murder, the selection, and the slaughter of the Jews, as was the case with the Beast of Auschwitz, but also of the survivors of this human catastrophe who bravely decided to raise their voices and point fingers at their executioners without fear of reprisal.